Welcome to today's Conversation Series program, Moving Beyond Compliance, How to Make D&I Part of Your Overall Business Strategy. So what are we talking about today? We are at an inflection point as we witness significant change in how organizations and individuals address the shared goal of building a diverse and inclusive workplace. This goal has been elusive and filled with unrealized potential when companies simply check the box on building diverse pipelines of talent, yet fail to embed the fundamental values of diversity and inclusion into their organizational culture. The result? Companies are building diverse and inclusive talent pipelines, but neglecting to address development, succession, and retention issues. Today, we'll discuss how to infuse a new way of thinking about diversity and inclusion into your leadership and culture that will make your efforts more meaningful and value-based. We'll discuss moving D&I beyond the checkbox compliance, systematically integrating D&I into your company culture, evolving D&I to a value-driven approach to talent management. We'll spend about 25 minutes addressing these points, and we'll then open it up for 25 minutes of Q&A. Please feel free to enter your questions directly into the Q&A box at any time during our session. To get started, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Claudine Debice. Claudine is Senior Vice President of Sales Enablement, Learning and Development at LHH, and will be leading today's discussion. Over to you, Claudine.
Thank you very much, Honesty, and welcome everyone to today's conversation. My name is Claudine Debice, and I lead LHH's Sales Enablement, Learning and Development team. I'm really passionate about helping organizations and individuals realize their own potential at work. And with extensive experience of working in a multicultural environment, having and also creating a sense of belonging at work is a very close topic to my heart. And I truly believe that no matter where we come from or who we are, we have so much more in common than differences. And we're better when we work together to reach our goals. We've brought today together a great panel to talk about how companies are looking to infuse a new way of thinking into their diversity and inclusion strategy. This really is a new approach that simply goes beyond building a diverse and inclusive talent pipeline. But we want to talk about how it addresses the role of leadership and culture and the strategic implementation of much more holistic D&I initiatives that bring more meaning and value. So just to recap, today we're going to be talking about moving beyond the tick box of compliance, of systematically integrating DE&I into your company culture, and also evolving to a value-driven approach to talent management. I'd like to invite my guest today to introduce themselves. Leonard, if you could start, please.
Thank you, Claudine, and good morning to everyone. I'm Leonard Posey. I'm Senior Associate with LHH. I'm in my 21st year with LHH and really in a new part of my career. The vast majority of my time in our business was spent from P&L leadership, managing a region. And since 2017, I have been very much involved in all things either inclusive leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm currently serving as a consultant to LHH with respect to building and helping shape a comprehensive global D&I practice and, a global D&I philosophy and plan. Glad to be here this morning.
Thanks very much, Leonard. Doug?
Thank you, Claudine, and thank you, Leonard and Robert. My name is Douglas Freeman. I'm the president of the Uniworld Group Global Reflections and Inclusive Leadership Practice. That's the DEI practice for Uniworld Group. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the organization, UWG at 51, going on 52 years old, is the oldest multicultural marketing and now DEI firm in the United States with offices on all continents. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today. UWG serves as strategic DEI partner to LHH.
Rob, if I could invite you to brief introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Claudine. Great to be here this morning, and hello to everyone. My name is Rob Hosking. I'm the SVP Managing Director of the recruitment or search practice at LHH Knightsbridge. This is a business that includes an executive search, a leadership search, and an interim executive search business. I'm also a founding member of the LHH Global Council for Inclusion and Belonging. I'm based in Toronto, and actually for the last 26 years, I've been leading teams and strategy in the staffing industry, partnering with organizations to really help them grow their business, achieve their goals through hiring and retention of top talent, and also working with individuals who are looking to make their next career move and to help them to achieve their goals as well.
Thanks, Rob. And before we kick off with the panelists, we'd love to get a sense, we're going to run a quick poll. We'd love to get a sense, a pulse check of where you would rank your organizations in your D&I approach. Are you top of your game? Are you somewhere in the middle? Do you think you're just getting started? Or have you not really done anything yet? We'll give everyone just a moment to get going on this, because we'd love to get as many people as possible to respond to the poll. We know that lots of organizations are making major strides in this area, but as it relates specifically to hiring and truly retaining diverse talent, companies are at various levels. So we'd love to have a base for the conversation today around where you all feel that you are at. So looking at the results, 4% of our audience are at the top of their game. That's fantastic. Somewhere in the middle, 41, but 51% following close behind with just getting started, and 4% saying that they haven't done anything yet. So look, we all know that improving diversity and inclusion, and particularly belonging, which brings all of that together in the workplace, is one of the most pressing issues that companies are facing. And the reality is it's been a key issue for years, several years, and we keep coming up short around that. Rob, what are your take on those results?
Yeah, thanks, Claudine. So it's interesting to see that many of the participants on the call today are feeling as though their organizations are really just getting started. So getting into the thinking about diversity and inclusion, and it is a journey, and there's no question that there's lots of elements to that journey and things to be thinking about and to be really digging into, and then others that are moving further along, and to see that kind of building process or putting things into place to be able to really help drive an inclusive organization and with a focus on diversity and inclusion. So good to see that. I think it'll really open up the conversation as we get into some of the questions, and then certainly encourage additional questions, because half of this call today is really dedicated to hearing from the participants and getting their insight, but also answering their questions and helping them. So this will be an exciting opportunity to dive in.
Absolutely, Rob. Yeah, and don't forget, guys, to put your, and girls, to put your questions in the Q&A box. So let's go straight in there. Doug, we talked about that. Where do you think so many organizations continue to miss the mark?
Yeah, that's a great question to kick off. Certainly, it's aligned with our topic. So many of our organizations have regulatory environments where compliance is the core, and that usually lies in their legal departments and, in some regards, their HR department. As we've seen over the years, there's been a tremendous evolution around D&I. Just as a quick historical backdrop, for many parts of the world, D&I is very different. In the North American context, particularly in the US and Canada, you had affirmative action models and other regulatory environments which had requirements around different sets of gender, populations, and ethnicity as a part of the workplace mix. When you're looking at the EU environment, for example, the regulatory world started much later. We're talking around 2000 with Article 7, with real protections in 6 major strands around age, around gender, religion, and disability. race, ethnicity, and immigration, and of course, sexual orientation. So those 6 big strands in an EU environment were the building blocks for what we see in DEI. Now, as we move to 2021, there's been a dramatic shift. And the shift has gone from compliance, and then we saw to management models, and now we're even moving towards leadership, culture, talent development, and really looking at a holistic view of diversity, equity, inclusion, and what we call the entire talent lifecycle, from sourcing all the way through to succession planning.
So that's, all the way through, and regulations as well. Obviously, we're learning from these shortcomings, and we need to continue to evolve our approaches across the board. As organizations and companies, re-examine that commitment and that approach to talent acquisition. Rob, what are we learning? What are the key things that we're learning?
Great. Well, thanks, Claudine. And to be honest, I think we've learned a lot, and there are so many moving parts in a successful D&I program, and companies have been really required to challenge themselves to think differently, deliberately about their approach to diversity and inclusion as it relates to recruitment and retention, which is what I'll kind of jump into. I think about a comprehensive diversity recruiting strategy. It's less about a quick and immediate impact and more about perseverance and influence. And it's really about senior leaders' support, organizational patience, and a recruiting process that's built with a focus of diversity right at its core. So most importantly, an effective diversity recruiting strategy requires support and advocacy from the senior leadership team or the executive leadership team within an organization. And leaders need to be able to then share with their extended teams, so all of the individuals within an organization, that increasing diversity is a strategic priority to which they'll hold themselves accountable and also hold others accountable to as well. So I've been in the staffing business for a really long time, and it's extremely rare to come across a role that didn't need to be filled immediately. And we're coming into, from a recruitment perspective today, sort of coming out of a pandemic, organizations are starting to hire again. We're seeing that start to accelerate and speed up. And so this urgency is only going to actually increase. And although it's really important, this can cause people to really focus on how fast they can fill a role rather than developing a qualified, diverse slate of candidates or a diverse slate of finalists for roles. And it becomes too easy to really fall back on those processes and things that have been in place more traditionally, which is the who do you know? I need to quickly hire. Where do I go to find somebody? It's who do I know? I'll ask the team, I'll ask others. I'll go to the same referral sources, the same recruiting sources, post the same job, and essentially end up with the same results and not necessarily have diversity at the core of the recruitment process. And so a couple of things that we're, certainly as we're working with organizations and talking to organizations, what they're doing or how they're building this into their plan. First starting with the actual job description. If you think about the vehicle to which many organizations will encourage people to either apply or learn about the role, there's many job postings that are designed to describe a person and not the job that needs to be filled. So the type of work that's actually involved. And when we unconsciously use words that are signals to certain kinds of candidates, we're really then limiting the diversity of the talent pool that we attract for those roles. So for example, there's been studies that have certainly focused in on words, and the word driven is a great example of one that in the job posting resonates with a lot of men. But it actually discourages women from applying in many cases. And on the other hand, women tend to be drawn to applying to jobs where the word inspiring is used. And so it should be a priority for all D&I programs to avoid those terms or descriptions that only attract candidates from a certain group or actually are they discourage underrepresented groups from applying to those roles as well. There are tools available that can be used and that can actually work through job descriptions to be able to flag words that lean one way or another and maybe can be replaced by something that is more inclusive, which certainly I know many organizations are starting to use. I'd also say that if we think about the broadening the concept of candidate qualifications. So achieving D&I goals will require organizations to think a little differently about the candidates for the roles and how they look at those roles. So holding, maybe holding too firmly to those really specific qualifications or requiring somebody to have the exact role in a company before they're somebody you might consider into your organization, or having really tight qualifications around educational requirements that are very specific, really limits your talent pool and makes it much more likely that you'll only draw people that maybe look and sound like the people that you already have on your team, and focusing less on former job titles and more on compatible or complementary skills that describe the qualities that are needed can really help within that. A couple of other things that I would say, having a diverse interview team is really important. The interview process is very much the eyes into an organization's culture and business, and so having a team that is diverse in that process can really help to demonstrate commitment to diversity within an organization. The mitigating bias within those that are involved within the process of hiring, and having training for those individuals to help them really be able to identify that they may have a bias or hidden bias, but to be able to put that forward and ensure that they're then focusing on the most critical elements of the role. A hiring manager toolkit that can help leaders within your organization to really know what to ask, how to ask, and again, how to be inclusive in the way that you're conducting those interviews. And then challenging the search firms that you're working with. If you're taking these positions and putting them externally, expect more from the firms that you may be partnering with. Where are they looking for candidates? How can they ensure an inclusive search process that identifies diverse candidates and be brought into that interview process? And really, how are they promoting you and your organization as an inclusive, diverse, and really value-driven company?
So lots there for us to think about, reaching different pools of talent, building strategic partners to make sure that there's a diverse pipeline, leveraging online tools, tapping into diverse networks, obviously considering legal frameworks, etc. You talked a lot about, how we also use internal tools, or as organizations we have available to us. Doug, I'd be really interested from pulling on your experience around culture. How do we move from that being compliance and tick box to it becoming part of an organization's DNA?
Right. So that's another standing question. Is what Rob has laid out so effectively is some really great, critical, technical components necessary to be effective at the recruiting piece. And as much as we get that right, which is obviously something very critical, culture wraps right around those technical pieces, right? So if we get the technical components right, and I think many of us are getting much better at it, and we're becoming much more systematic. And I just want to point out and also talk to a colleague of mine, Fred Smith, who's done an analysis of that entire sourcing, recruiting to job hire process with some of our UWG internal PhDs. And there are about 28, 29 steps. And we usually break those steps into 4 big buckets. And everything Rob's talked about are those big critical pieces of those steps, from the job piece to the interview panels to diverse candidate slates. And then we have something that's really important, because as we see as a major breakdown of that 4th bucket, where we're really looking at the finalist and an actual offer, we call it that last mile. Oftentimes, D&I or diverse candidates may not make it 9 times out of 10 in that last mile. And when you see that phenomenon happening, you've mastered all of those other pieces. Usually there's a unconscious bias of the organization and culture breakdown, things like an industry bias. So that 9 times out of 10, the candidates that win have strength of industry, yet maybe that diverse candidate doesn't, even though the transferable skills clearly were there to get to the final piece. So I would also say that last mile is something really important in your buckets in the technical process to make sure that you've done all this great work and you don't see that breakdown occurring. Now, as you can imagine, the transition occurs now that a diverse candidate and maybe a set of diverse candidates are in your organization. What is the culture doing to be ready? And oftentimes, this is the notion of building cultures of inclusion, engagement, and high performance that will enable all talent to thrive and contribute appropriately to the organization. Oftentimes, this requires not just inclusive leadership up top or in the middle tiers, it's a notion of building inclusive culture writ large, enterprise-wide, all levels of the organization. So what we're finding is necessary is a systematic approach. One of the ways that we do it is a 3 Ps model. There are lots of different inclusive leadership models. The importance is that there is that inclusive leadership approach where the organization is committed. Some of the key areas around inclusive leadership from a skill point, and Rob, and I'm sure Leonard will mention these, unconscious bias. And the real pieces around unconscious bias, as we know, these are learned stereotypes that trigger automatically right when we see another person or typically a person of difference. So how do we de-risk our decision making? How do we create in our moments of truth ways to move out of that default model and now to make what we call more effective decisions, and particularly in the talent process? That's going to occur in performance evaluation. It's going to take place when it comes to selection for high performance programs, high potential programs, mentoring programs, stretch goal assignments, and advancement and promotion. You have to utilize those more effective decision-making tools, de-bias, and get people prepared for making the more appropriate or more effective decision in this entire process. So everything from unconscious bias to emotional intelligence, cultural competence, inclusive work networks, all of these types of skills will be critical to ensure that once that diverse talent and any new talent comes in, that you enable that talent to move and be effective like any. And what's ultimately happening is you're starting to create an inclusive talent life cycle, which is ultimately a foundational technical piece for that entire cultural construct.
Thank you, Doug. So in there, you must have said the word leadership a few different times. And Rob's mentioned it, I've mentioned it. I'd love Leonard to get, it all starts with leadership, right? So top and bottom coming together. Leonard, I'd love to get your perspective on, how leaders can really be driving this change.
Thanks, Claudine. I think last year, 2020, and certainly this year have been one of the most challenging times in the life of leaders and organizations today, particularly around this particular topic. If you just look at the mix of the impact that the global pandemic has had on the world, add that to not just what happened here in the United States, but throughout the world with respect to the social unrest and people really speaking out to social injustice. Leaders and Doug had talked about the evolution and of this whole science of diversity and inclusion, and Rob made reference to the senior leader commitment. Governing boards today are now looking for senior leaders, people in the C-suite who really bring a much broader transformational point of view to running an organization now than just being adept and being skilled and being competent in the areas of sales and marketing and operations. The impact that the cancel culture may have on the organization with respect to something that an employee says or does that's now captured, the impact of making sure that their organizations are inclusive and that people feel that they belong in organization, the impact that engagement, employee retention has, and the impact that inclusion and diversity have on that now is really taxing and trying, I think, a lot of senior leaders. So we're seeing now that leaders are having to be very transformational. Doug had talked about the culture and the importance of that. So it becomes something much greater than just passing off the responsibility of compliance to an individual, a chief diversity officer in the organization, but it really is a senior leader in the C-suite taking ownership of this responsibility of embedding into the culture diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and then making sure that it's cascaded throughout the organization and measuring it in such a way that really helps them stay competitive and helps them in some cases, in many cases, hopefully gain a competitive edge.
Yeah, thank you, Leonard. I think that's really important. We talked a lot about the right things to do and how to move things through the recruitment process and culture and leadership. But what are the actual milestones, Doug, that tell us you're on the right track here, right? What can people measure tangibly that moves the dial?
Absolutely. So there are different levels of metrics. Certainly, they're the counting metrics or the representation metrics. Those, of course, are important. Oftentimes, those are based on visible elements of a person's identity, gender, ethnicity, race alike. There are also self-identification metrics as well around sexual orientation, around disabilities, and particularly in the North American environment around veterans status. And for those who are outside of North America might be familiar, that's people who have been involved in military service as part of their work experience. So those are all representation metrics. And oftentimes, for a variety of reasons in our various marketplace, we have, in many cases, representations of the communities we serve from a demographics perspective in those key areas that are very reflective. When you look at the entire organization, oftentimes the breakdowns are at the middle management layer, where we don't see the reflection, and at the senior management layer as well. So organizations are putting in place what they call goals, and we have to make this very clear. There are no quota. I can't think of a regulatory environment, please somebody correct me if I'm wrong, where quotas are enabled or allowed. What you have are goals. So what you try to do is increase the numbers so that you're getting closer to representation numbers, particularly in the communities you serve. So that's one big chunk of metrics. The other chunk of metrics tend to be around engagement and culture type metrics. So for those of you who are familiar with pulse surveys or employee engagement surveys, those are big areas of looks to give you a snapshot around the organization. Now, what makes that snapshot interesting is demographics. And demographics aren't the usual. So it's not just potentially gender, ethnicity, but it's things like age. So what's going on in engagement around different age categories. Tenure is another major area. Sometimes you'll look at business unit or business function. Oftentimes you'll compare countries and continents and geographies and so on and so forth. So the ability, we call it slice and dice, the ability to look at your engagement data because what you're looking for are hot spots or breakdowns. Are there areas when you compare and contrast your overall engagement scores, and when you look at these demographic views and you see a number that's considerably lower, that raises the aha. We need to do a deeper dive to see exactly why that score is not at parity. So that's another big area around the cultural pieces. And then as you continue to look around other key elements, you can break down your life cycle and you can look at promotions and you can look at the demographics of promotions. If you see that one group, and it may be older males, are the only group who from entry to middle to top levels are being advanced, you have aha moments as well. So you can look at the promotion. And then you also like to look at turnover rates. Turnover rates can be an interesting indicator who's coming in. So what's the demography of the people coming in? Turnover is who's going out. And oftentimes there's not only can you look at the demographics of who's going out and seeing if the breakdowns as a standalone. So if we see more Hispanic females moving out of the organization, we have aha moments and ask why. But you can also compare that to who's coming in demographically. So we may see, for example, we don't have a certain population of women. Look, if you're in a tech company, you may see that you have very few older women coming in, right? And it's all young men. And that's, so there's lots of different ways to look at metrics to ensure that you have one, baselines, and two, you move into goals like any other business metric. How are you measuring on a monthly and quarterly and yearly basis to reach your core objectives? We can't forget in this day and age, particularly in the North American environment, we're going to probably have the opportunity to talk about RFPs and client impact, B2B sales. DEI is everywhere in the RFP process, and it's only become, and it's on a global scale as well, but certainly in North America, 80+% of your RFPs are going to have critical supplier diversity, workforce diversity questions in them, and you'll have to have metrics to see how effectively you are answering those questions and what are your win percentages with those type of questions being core to the evaluation of an RFP.
Thank you, Doug. RFP, for those who aren't familiar, request for proposal. I think you're absolutely right. Organisations across the board are being asked this. I'd love to get to the questions that we've got in the Q&A. Just before I do, Rob, can I just ask you for to round up on assimilation? Because I think it's really important. We've heard about the statistics, we've heard about leadership, but then, you know, I'd love for your perspective just to round it up around, you know, what do people do around assimilation?
Sure thing. Well, thanks, Claudine. And you know, it's definitely, assimilation can really be challenging, and it's even more challenging when people, in many cases, are working remotely or still working remotely. They haven't necessarily met their colleagues or leaders in person. The entire onboarding process was done virtually, or the hiring process was actually done virtually. And you know, there was a survey that just over 1,000 employees were surveyed, which revealed that 31% of people left a job within the first 6 months, and with 68% of those departing within the first 3 months, which is a huge number when you think about that. And the question comes back to, were those individuals, did they leave because it wasn't what they anticipated or expected, or was there an issue with assimilation into the organization? And you know, you think about to feel good about making the decision that somebody has made, and once they're there, you want them to be a long-term employee. So I think back to my first true corporate job as a gay man. I found that assimilation was very challenging, actually. I wasn't comfortable being out. I wasn't comfortable being myself at work. I wasn't sure it was safe to be. I didn't feel as though there was a safe space or opportunity for me to be out. I didn't see others, or I certainly didn't meet others within the organization who I felt were like me, and that was a bit challenging. So I lived a bit of a don't ask, don't tell, which is really stressful and actually uncomfortable, and I lived that for quite some time. And so if I think back to that period and what would have made that different, or how could that have been a better experience for me, there are a couple of things that certainly jump out. And number one is right from the very beginning of the interview process, learning about the organization and what their values were, and do they align, or did they align with mine? And were there values that were specifically related to diversity and inclusion? And knowing that as I was going through that journey, recognizing that I was being embraced for who I was, and that my differences were actually being valued and appreciated. And I certainly didn't know that I felt that way. And so as a leader, thinking, how can I help others as they integrate into the organization to feel valued and appreciated as a leader? The existence of communities within organizations can certainly help. In the case of underrepresented employees, it can make a world of difference to know that there are other people who are like them that can help them in their journey, as Leonard mentioned, mentorship and that relationship. Having a manager that's really supportive and is trained to lead a diverse team is really important. And I think managers needing to understand that their behaviors really do impact their team members' sense of belonging. What they say, how they say it, when they say it, may not even be intentional, but not being trained or not understanding differences culturally can really pose a problem from a leadership perspective and cause people to shut down and feel very uncomfortable in their environment. So encouraging leaders to continually assess that process, ensure that everyone on the team gets the same opportunities. And then maybe the other one would be the path to growth within an organization. And this was mentioned both by Doug and Leonard in terms of the opportunities that are made available to somebody, but that there's transparency around that. What does that next step potentially look like? What are the competencies to be able to get there? Maybe it's having that criteria public and giving everyone exposure, but certainly giving diverse candidates exposure to senior leaders early on in their process, because it really is, when you think about promotion or promotability, is often dependent on the relationships with senior leaders. Getting to know those senior leaders, really being able to demonstrate capabilities and having them part of that onboard process is key. And I think it really does stem to strong onboarding process that's very inclusive.
Thank you. And thank you also for sharing your own story. That's, great, especially at the beginning of Pride Month, to hear from, happy Pride, everybody. Look, we've got loads of questions. Unfortunately, we can't answer all of them. There are a few that have the same sort of grouped in similar topics. So there's one here, which is, when we're talking about hiring the right person for the team rather than the right person for the job, and you talked about this, in fact, I think all three of you talked about this, but Rob, if we could stay with you, should we change our job postings to talk about the team as well as hiring the right person? So we're talking about hiring the right person for the team rather than the right person for the job. Should we change our job posting to talk about the team as well?
I think they certainly can be, and because really it's all encompassing in terms of the individual joining an organization, you're joining a team, and to be part of that team. And I think it's ensuring that the language is there from an inclusive perspective, so that everybody is encouraged to not only apply, but would feel comfortable applying and feel as though that they would be part of that team. But I think describing or including elements of team in the posting is good, because it does help to know what you can expect or what you can look for when you do join the organization. And again, that will come out in the interview process as well, but may encourage actually people to lean into that role and feel, hey, this is something that I can really embrace and be part of, and it's an inclusive environment and it's an inclusive team that I'll be joining. So I actually think that certainly can be an element of the posting.
Right, and I know sometimes I've had people within the team just have like conversations with final applicants, so that there is that two-way experience as well, and it's worked really well. We've got a number of questions here, and Doug, would love your take on this, and then perhaps Robert and Leonard, you could build a little bit. We've got a number of questions around male-dominated professions. So I'm going to try and generalize the question. How do businesses, either because they are very male-dominated industries, or are very male-dominated workplaces, how and face challenges in attracting female applicants to positions? What suggestions does the panel have as to how to break down, first of all, perceptions, and also make those roles more attractive? Doug, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, yeah, and that's a great, and I did see one, and I want to give a shout to the person in Scotland, rugby union. The reason I say that, I played rugby for many years and against my Scottish colleagues, and of course, they did very well. So congrats to you. That was one of the questions that was raised in a relatively male-dominant environment. So there are a few elements to think about when you think about organizations as a whole. And this is a similar question that for many years and still going on in Silicon Valley, very male dominant with engineers and the like. If one looks at an enterprise and an organization, the first thing is not all jobs are the same, right? We tend to have core functional areas. We have the ops area, and we have marketing and sales, and we have core technical and engineering and innovation areas. We have human resources and legal and so on and so forth. So it's not a good enough answer to say that our profession, construction industry, is another big industry, male dominant and so on, particularly in field. It's not a good enough answer to say we're a male dominant industry and therefore we can't. There are a whole host of jobs that really any person should be able to fill, and perhaps in those functional areas, there's strength in the marketplace for talent. So one is better served analyzing the functional areas and going for the low-hanging fruit, per se, and saying maybe finance area. We have a job open in finance. We happen to be in a male-dominant industry. Would we not be well served to open up our talent pools and move towards having all level of participation, not industry specific? No offense to the construction industry or tech, but finance skills are typically very transferable skills. HR skills, typically very transferable. Marketing, so on and so forth. So why don't we look to have a broader pool of talent, particularly outreach to women in our outreach efforts, and ensure that that diverse pool of talent is given the opportunity. And it's merely, we call this merely to compete. I saw a question around the best candidate. Hey, if we change qualification, would you? We're not talking about changing qualifications to, or changing resumes to undermine qualifications. We're really talking to the technical elements and forcing people to think through what really is required to do this job. Do you need to be a part of an industry to crunch a number in finance? I mean, seriously, do you have to be a Facebook person to work at Microsoft? Because couldn't a Microsoft person work at a construction place if they're in finance? Probably yes. Probably as an HR firm, supply chain, and so on. So there are many of our jobs that are transferable skills built that don't have to have that industry bias or even a certain experience level. And we even say, even certain degree levels. Oftentimes we see master's degree or MBA preferred. Is that really required if a person can do the job? So I think those are the fundamental questions. You have to push your organization to say, what are the real requirements? Not traditionally, what have we done? What are the real requirements of the role? Can we take transferable skills from any industry? Because often when you can do that, you open up your job pool to many more qualified candidates. And then you have to also ask the question in a male dominant, well, they're not going to be a culture fit. Well, guess what? The world has moved beyond culture fit to culture add. there's a very high probability bringing in a fair number of female candidates with different perspectives who are not pinned to your industry. It's going to offer a whole host of different perspectives that will drive innovation and value in ways you couldn't even imagine in your previous traditional models.
Thank you. And I'm not actually going to get you to build on that panel. I'm just going to take another question so we can get a few more questions in. But thank you, Deb. Very, very comprehensive. Len, if I could ask you, there's a question here. It says, in what ways can senior managers help to ensure cultural change is cascaded down through the organization? Should the message quite literally come from them, i.e. should they be the ones to send initiative emails or to be speaking to managers instead of HR? And I know this is very close to your heart, so please, let's have your view.
Thanks, Claudine. So we've heard throughout our discussion today, and any of you that are out there that read up on how organizations and leaders become successful in this area, you'll see the common thread that senior leader, the top person in the organization, has to be the one who really stands up and steps forward with respect to commitment. So that's important, but what really helps, I think, define success with respect to whatever the organization is trying to do, and if it's around talent acquisition, is it around talent development, is it around retention or engagement, is to have the message cascade throughout the organization. And something that I learned, in fact, that something that Doug taught me some years ago, is that what has to be defined is the what's in it for me. So our leaders and employees have to understand where they fit in this equation, and how their participation, their buy-in will benefit them and thus the organization. And once that is explored, identified, and discussed, and embedded within the culture of the organization, if I, as an individual contributor, am able to see that my manager's message with respect to DE&I will add benefit to me, organizationally, financially, then it's much easier, I think, for people to feel that they've got some buy-in in this, and that they've got a stake in this, and that they can help lead to success.
And I want to, Claudine, do something a little bit unorthodox, but I think I don't like dismiss. I saw a question in there, and I want to go in a real-time role modeling situation around emotional intelligence, particularly as a inclusive leadership tool, because we have organizations that are very competitive. Somebody noted in the chat that I mentioned Uniworld is on all continents, and they said including Antarctica. Now, we always, as competitive people, like to correct and so on and so forth. But there is a shift in how we engage our fellow colleagues when something like that is occurring in the workplace. And if you assume that people are professional and they have levels of intelligence, this is where something called empathy can be very important as an emotional intelligence tool. The default world is to go into and immediately correct an employee and say they're wrong and so on, and almost microaggress and chastise, even if you're technically correct. In our world of inclusive leadership, we use tools like empathy, and we ask the question, now the person may have made that technical inaccuracy, but let me place myself in that person's shoes. What is that person doing right? This person is presenting in front of 300 people, live audience, for the first time, and may have jitters and so on and so forth. Or they may be under workplace pressures and stresses and so on and so forth. What may have been more appropriate from a role modeling of inclusive leadership, maybe I should ask the person, I know you stated this, but did you mean to state that this was what you're conveying? Because that doesn't seem like something of a professional's level to make that kind of fundamental error. That's an example of role modeling and inclusive behavior, where we don't jump on a person for something as basic as a minor technical error and functionally engage in microaggressions that undermine the morale of an individual. We attempt to learn why that occurrence took place, and then we determine how we appropriately decide and act in a way, hopefully, that's more engaging than dismissive of an individual on the team.
Thank you, Doug, for doing that and for going through the questions and choosing one. I really appreciate the answer and taking that live. Let's have one more question, let's start, Rob, with you. I've got a point of view on this as well, by the way, which is, do you think an HR department is an essential part of any drive for diversity? Our company does not have HR, and I'm wondering if that is hindering us. What are your thoughts? Rob, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So I certainly believe where there is HR and where there is a team, that they are a fundamental part of diversity and inclusion. And in many organizations, the HR team owns the function or certainly leads within the D&I space, depending on organizational structure. If there is somebody who's a manager, director, VP of diversity and inclusion, will sometimes report into HR. Sometimes they'll actually report into the CEO within an organization, depending on size and scope. So I certainly think that there's an element of this, and I think there's an opportunity, where maybe there isn't, to come up with a different strategy or maybe focus around who would own or more broadly deal with or focus on diversity and inclusion, and that could be more of a committee within the company with a number of different people, or owned certainly by the CEO or COO within the organization to really continue to drive that. And then again, that's often based on size of company. So it doesn't necessarily, or maybe shouldn't necessarily hinder, but it can add some complexity when there isn't an HR group, but allowing for others to really step in and help encourage and own that function.
Right. Thank you, Rob. Leonard, would you like to build on that?
Sure. I think organizations that don't have an HR function, you have to ask the question as to why. HR organizations, departments, divisions have really evolved. We've used that word a lot over the last 30 years or so. And I think we find in the field of D&I that most chief diversity officers either work within the HR organization or have a close connection to them. So when you're looking at employee advancement, employee acquisition, and you're looking at retention as a key part of driving a DE&I philosophy, strategy, then you've got to have some close alignment with human resources. So it's organization, particularly of any size, that either don't have an HR organizations, or the HR organization is not attached to what's going on from a DE&I standpoint, I would guess would have some challenges with respect to implementing an effective DE&I strategy.
Final word, Doug, on your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's the HR function is becoming much more important. We are finally figuring out that organizations are people first, not product first organization. And so the HR functionality has to be core, critical. DEI, at least in terms of roles, are being fused as core functional areas. And we also are seeing the DEI role taking on far more prominence in the core business as a whole, which we think is very important, because diversity, equity, inclusion is a multi-layered demographic phenomena. What is occurring in society trickles into the workplace, trickles into the customer base, trickles into supply chain, government, politics, and the like, all of which impacts the proper functioning of a business.
Thank you. So look, we've literally just got a couple of minutes to go. We've got so many great questions in the chat, but obviously we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So just one more question in terms of somebody's asked, you know, surely talent should be above all else when we're recruiting. Rob?
I mean, certainly, and when you think talent, I mean, talent, obviously, the capabilities or skills to do the job is certainly, you know, a primary focus, and absolutely what when going through the interview process and ensuring that the right person for the role has those capabilities. It's how those capabilities are identified or how they're laid out, and ensuring that everybody feels that who has those capabilities, that they are not only qualified to be able to do the job, but would be considered for the role and are viable for the position. So, you know, certainly an important element, but it's broadening the net to ensure that everybody feels comfortable applying and being part of that process and is included in that process, and thinking differently a little bit in terms of the capabilities that are necessarily required, and what would make that person successful.
Thank you. And on that note, I'd just like to thank the entire panel, Leonard, Posey, Doug Freeman, Robert Hosking. Thank you so much for joining us today and being so open and honest with your answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudine.
Thank
Great
you very
job.
much, Claudine.
Thanks very much.
Done.
Great
Thanks,
job.
everyone.
Thank you.
So again, thank you to our panelists and all of you for joining us today. We'd like to invite you to visit us for the latest thinking on what it takes to transform organizations by visiting us at lhh.com/transformation-insights. We hope you all have a great day.
Today's careers look very little like the linear careers of the past. Our lives and our careers are unique journeys of personal and professional growth. Along the way, we experience many moments of change and transition, challenge and success. Every person has their own unique story, and LHH is there for every key career moment. To find the perfect match between people and jobs, we help reveal who has the right skills and the right fit, and we deliver insights that help people uncover who they are and the keys to their success. When they take on new challenges or step into leadership roles, we help people reach their true potential, accelerate their team's success, and elevate the company's performance. When new technologies or big changes in the world create new career paths, we help people renew their skills, reinvent themselves, and move into exciting new jobs within their current companies. And when change in the business means people need to continue their journey in a different company, we help them refresh their careers and discover new opportunities. Life is all about transitions and navigating key career moments with skill. LHH is here for every career journey to deliver on every opportunity, every step of the way. Visit lhh.com to learn more.